Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Tom Farr, and on behalf of the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs and its director, Tom Banchoff, welcome to the campus of Georgetown University and our program today, Religion in American Society and Politics, a Model for Other Nations, ? This is the last in a series of 12 conferences that we've held over the last 4 years at Georgetown under the auspices of the Berkeley Center's program on religion and U.S. foreign policy, which I direct, and with the generosity of the Henry Luce Foundation. And I want to thank the Luce Foundation for its support over these last several years. We have publications up front from virtually every one of these conferences, and you can also find them on the Berkeley Center webpage. But for those of you who may not be aware of it, we have just been awarded at the Berkeley Center a 3-year, $2 million grant by the Templeton Foundation for a religious freedom project. You have a brochure there at your seats, which I hope you'll take a look at. It will give you the information about this program. We're very excited about it. It will, as I say, last for at least 3 years. Please go to the website, which, as they say, is under construction, but already has a number of exciting things, including a letter to the President by our keynote speaker today, Archbishop Chaput. I would also mention that my co-director for the Religious Freedom Project, Tim Shaw, will be here this morning. Our project associate, Kyle Vandermeulen, is here, so if you have any questions about the program, please seek out one of us and we'll be glad to answer them. Let me turn now to our topic for today, which is, in essence, an examination of two questions. First, what can be said about the American system of religious freedom, that is, religion's place in American society and politics? We Americans certainly are not perfect on this score. We've had a history of persecuting our own, and there are some contemporary concerns, serious concerns about protecting the rights of conscience and about the rights of majorities to express, and minorities, to express their religiously informed judgments in the political life of the country. Nevertheless, I think it would be difficult to find a system of religious freedom in the world that has been more successful in accommodating religious ideas and religious actors. So our second question is, what, if anything, does the American experience have to offer other societies, especially those that are struggling to root democratic institutions and self-governance so that they may have security, economic and political stability and prosperity? The sad reality is that, viewed from the perspective of religious freedom, the world is a very unstable and dangerous place. According to a comprehensive study by the Pew Forum, 70% of the world's population lives in countries where their religious freedom is either highly restricted or very highly restricted. This religious freedom deficit not only comprises a humanitarian crisis of the first order, but it implicates American national security interests and international security interests. Let me give you a small sampling of the problem from very recent news reports. In Egypt, the ancient Coptic minority is experiencing fierce persecution. It also fears that religious extremists will gain political power in Egypt. That remains a possibility not only in Egypt, but in Libya, Tunisia, Jordan, Yemen, and elsewhere in the Middle East. In Iraq, the very existence of an ancient Christian minority is under threat as its members, subject to severe persecution, continue to flee the country. In Pakistan, blasphemy laws have led to the death sentences of Christians and Muslim reformers alike. Minority Ahmadis live in constant fear of persecution. Al-Qaeda continues to operate in this nuclear-armed nation. In Afghanistan, Taliban ideology continues to flourish. Afghan Muslim reformers have been prosecuted and sentenced to death for blasphemy. An Islamic apostate was recently sentenced to death and released only after international pressure. He fled the country. China continues its periodic crackdowns on Uyghur Muslims and its policy of undermining Tibetan Buddhist culture. In India, Hindu extremists threaten Muslim and Christian minorities. In Russia, Christian Orthodox leaders too often refused to stand for the religious freedom of others. In short, despite the hope we all share that democracy, stable democracy, will be achieved by the peoples of the world, the global status of religious freedom appears never to have been worse. The United States, which has a formal policy of advancing religious freedom, has done, frankly, very little to address this crisis. But leaving U.S. foreign policy aside, what, if anything, does the American system of dealing with religion in society and politics have to say to democratic reformers around the world, religious and secular? Does the way that our nation struggles with the religious-secular divide and all of our culture war issues in any sense provide a model for other nations struggling to root democracy and achieve its benefits for all its citizens? We pose today to all of our panelists, those on this panel and those to come, 3 questions, and I want to read them to you briefly. What is the proper role of religious ideas in the political life of the nation? This is the first question. May religious individuals or religious communities make explicitly religious arguments or religiously informed moral arguments for laws and policies? For example, may Christians and Jews legitimately make scriptural arguments or Muslims arguments from the Quran or Hadith for or against particular foreign policies or economic policies, for or against gay marriage, for or against embryonic stem cell research? If so, why? And what limits, if any, should obtain? If not, why not? Second question, does the American system encompass a right of faith-affiliated organizations to hire only their co-religionists? Should conscientious religious objections to providing contraceptives or performing abortions be accommodated in law and policy, such as the health care bill recently passed? If so, why? If not, why not? Number 3, and the final question, on balance, is the dominant American approach to religion, society, and the state, namely freedom of belief and the freedom to engage society and politics on the basis of that belief, worthy of emulation in other countries? What are the implications for U.S. foreign policy around issues of international religious freedom and the controversial issue of proselytism? These questions are not only academic, the answers carry policy implications both for the American future and for U.S. efforts to promote religious freedom around the world and democracy. The issue intersects with global controversies about international norms, national self-determination, proselytism, and the rights of religious communities. Today, 3 panels are going to examine these questions from the perspective of Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, respectively. Archbishop Charles Chaput of Denver will deliver a lunchtime keynote address, which he has entitled, Subject to the Governor of the Universe, the American Experience and Global Religious Liberty. I've had the opportunity to read this address, and I can tell you you're in for a treat. So without further ado, let me introduce my colleague, Catherine Marshall, a senior fellow at the Berkeley Center, who will moderate our first panel entitled The Jewish Experience. Catherine.
Thank you, and good morning to all of you. Delighted that you could come and participate in what will be a fascinating and I think thought-provoking day for everyone. My task is primarily to get us started and to introduce our panelists. Tom Farr has already given you a very clear idea of the mandate that they've been given. So each one of them has been asked to address these particular questions in whatever way they choose. The only thing is that they have 10 minutes for the initial presentation so that we'll have time for an exchange among the panel, I hope, but also with the audience. So let me introduce these people. You have the biographies, so I will not read them, but give you some of the highlights. I did ask a couple of the people whether there were any surprises that I could give you, and they were quite reticent on the subject. But Marshall Breger brings to this discussion experience as a professor of law at Catholic University. He has experience as a journalist, writing for a number of different periodicals and newspapers. He has worked in a public policy think tank, the Heritage Foundation, and he also has worked in government and public service. So he has an extraordinary record of writing and a great deal of experience to share with us. So he will go first. Randi Rashkover, there is an important correction for which we congratulate her. She is now not an assistant, but an associate professor in the Religious Studies Department at George Mason University. And she has a new book, which is Freedom and Law, A Jewish Christian Apologetics, published by Fordham University Press. She emphasized that she did not give a presentation last week to 100 clerics at the Vatican, but that she is very much a scholar and sees herself as a scholar in approaching these issues. And third, David Saperstein, Rabbi David Saperstein, believe it or not, has been for 30 years, he says, the director of the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism, which involves him in an extraordinary range of public policy issues. One thing that's not mentioned here is that I turned on the television, I think I was in Bhutan at the time, when Barack Obama was nominated, and there was David giving the invocation at the Democratic Convention. So this gives, I think, a sense of his prominence and the respect. He's also, I think, called the most influential rabbi in the United States, perhaps?
An interview with my mother.
Exactly.
But in any event, David is a font of wisdom on an extraordinary range of issues that go from religious freedom in different parts of the world through something like obstetric fistula, where he chaired a meeting not very long ago. So that's a brief introduction just to give you a couple of nuggets from the biographies, and without further ado, we'll turn to Professor Breger.
Thank you very much. They really squeezed us in 10 minutes, so I'll try to just touch on a few things. I'm not going to talk about Judaism as a religion. It's very complicated and varied in terms of the view of religion and the state. Remember when Samuel told God that the people wanted a king, God was annoyed. He said, does that mean that that they want to reject me? So there's always been a kind of uncertain relationship between the priest and the civil society, although in general in Judaism, the purpose of certainly on the Maimonides, the purpose of the king was to further the goals of the Lord. So that's a kind of religious view. I'm going to talk more about the Jewish community in the United States, which has understandably been very supportive of separation of church and state. After all, until World War II, America was a Protestant country. Judaism was a minority. Separation meant that they would have more freedom. We know World War II made a Judeo-Christian approach. So you had reverends and priests and rabbis all blessing yachting regattas as well as Congress. Then we started to move to an Abrahamic society, but including Islam, but that issue is now on the table, and we don't seem to know how we're dealing with Islam in the American religious fabric. But the Jewish community has always been positive towards the separation of church and state. In some respects, in the 60s, it was the jurisprudential leader in terms of promoting in the courts separation of church and state. The issue for the the differences in the Jewish community has always been, how high should the wall be? Should it be a wall? I mean, of course, I always have to make a joke. The last time people tried to build a wall to the sky, it was the Tower of Babel, so you can wonder, maybe high may not always work, but the idea of no connection between the state and religion was the central view, I think, of most of the Jewish defense agencies, and in some respects still is. There are alternate views, and they reflect different views in American jurisprudence. The notion that you can't give any anything that benefits religion at all is a problem. The notion that you can benefit religion if it's inadvertent, if you're providing a welfare good and it inadvertently benefits religion. There is one view that only few Jews take. It's a view that sometimes Justice Scalia has had. Lubavitcher Rabbi takes it that, yes, it's good to promote religion as long as you don't promote a specific religion. And I think most of the Jewish community has been worried about that because, and in my view correctly, it's very hard to have a generic religiosity. But that's our general view on church and state. Now, in terms of religion in the political world, in one sense, the Jews are afraid of it because they figure if it's going to be religion, it probably won't be their religion. And it's really only among the Orthodox that there is this sense, well, we're in a culture war, so we got to get all of the religions have to be together, and the pagans are on one side, the secularists on one side. So there's an uncomfortableness about religious language in the Jewish community generally. I myself don't quite agree with that. It seems to me that in a democracy you can use any kind of language if it's civil. The problem with religious language is that in one sense it only speaks to the believer. I mean, it's a private language. So if you want to convince more than your own flock, you may want to use public language, public reason, John Rawls uses the word. And that's, by the way, religious appeals can also be consonant with public reason. Natural law arguments would be similar. I think the problem where the Jews get most concerned is with the question of religious authority telling the flock, or the flock in its persona as citizens, how to vote, what they should vote on. And of course, it's a big problem in Judaism. Jewish law deals with many, many things: how you wake up, how you eat, how you have sex, how you die. And if everything has a religious purpose, in one sense, it's to make the profane holy. So that, but on the other hand, it limits the area where individual has autonomy as opposed to deferring to religious texts, and if you're not an expert on the text, deferring to religious experts. There's been a shift in Orthodox Judaism towards the notion of Das Torah, the idea that you ask the views of the Torah sages on everything. This can become almost deracinated. The people used to go to the Lubavitcher Rebbe to find out whether to buy gold or palladium. By the way, his advice often turned out very good from an economic point of view. But I mean, most even religious Jews would make some a clearer distinction between the things of the Lord and the things that are of man, and those things that are of man are not. The rabbis don't necessarily know more than you. Now, there's a big problem I think the Jews have with again, frankly, I have the bishops here, so I'll say it, with the question of religious authority telling the flock how they should vote. or telling certain politicians that if they don't vote a certain way, they will be excommunicated or not get certain religious benefits. I have no comment on that. It's not my religion. And of course, one should be free within one's religion to organize the rules however you see fit. I have only one kind of political science comment, a point of prudence. One should make sure that you have the whole polity on your side. The reason that Catholics had so much trouble in American political life until John Kennedy was a fear that Catholic politicians take orders from Rome. And we're over that now, but that might be, feeling might be, people might be reminded of that fear, at least those who oppose the beliefs of religious orthodoxy in certain areas. If I have time to just say one word about the American model abroad.
You're almost there.
I'll be very quick. Look, it's very hard, whatever the Jews say, it's very hard for them to totally promote the American model abroad because Israel's a very different model. It's not a model of complete religious freedom. I think the problem, and I can go into that in the questions at length. I mean, it's basically an adaptation of the Ottoman millet system, where religion is given certain monopolies by the state. To some extent, this is a debate between individualism and really Protestant individualism in terms of religion, and religion in its social role. And the extent to which the religion has a social role in societies, and in particular in Islam and in Judaism too, there is a problem, the society has a problem with religious freedom that disorders the society. So it's not just a question of one individual seeing the light, it's kind of disordering the whole society. And I think one has to recognize that even as one pushes to promote religious freedom. And one final note in this, I think one of the problems is we often in the U.S., America, approach this in terms of categories that other societies don't understand. I mean, I found if you talk about women's rights, some of the Muslim countries don't grasp what you're talking about. If you talk about women's dignity, they may be far beyond what the people in talking about women's rights were speaking of. So you have to really understand, even take proselytism. One of the biggest issues in terms of opposition to proselytism is not the Muslim opposition of proselytism, it's the recognized Christian communities who in Jordan asked the king, stop those evangelical Protestant proselytizers because they're poaching our flock. So you have to understand the country before, even as you try to promote American approaches toward religious freedom, which I think we should do. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Can I set up there?
Yeah. Professor Rashkover.
Well, I got here early, so I've earned 3 more minutes. Okay. First of all, I want to thank Tom Farr for inviting all of us. It's a great session, and it's nice to be here. For the past 25 years, the question of how religion ought to operate in the public square in America has been dominated by the dialectic between John Rawls's Enlightenment-based legal proceduralism and Michael Sandel's communitarianism. Both Rawls and Sandel were concerned to illuminate the conditions of justice within a democratic system, and they considered the role of religious belief only from this context. Particular focus on the rationality of religious belief within democratic discourse emerged in the wake of Stephen Carter's The Culture of Disbelief and Jeff Stout's Democracy and Tradition. However, even these analyses presuppose the state and its governing processes as the primary context within which questions of religious freedom and rationality were to be examined. The logic of this discourse reflects one particular interpretation of the relationship between the two parts of the religion clause of the First Amendment, specifically the determination of the second part, that is, the exercise of free religion, by the first part, the disestablishment of religion by Congress. Not only would I like to suggest that this discourse on the relationship between religion and politics has been dominated by this interpretation of the religion clause, which renders religious freedom contingent upon government regulation, I would like to highlight the implicit secularism of this logic. In his Public Religions in the Modern World, Jose Casanova argues that religion does and should assume a robust role in the public square if and only if it, quote, conforms to the universalistic criteria of open rational debate, unquote. Casanova's position sustains two troubling assumptions that I think are operative in the questions today posed for the panel regarding the proper role of religion within political discourse. These two assumptions are, one, religion's role within the public square requires constraint or delimitation, and two, it is the state or the public that determines what constraints or role religion ought to have. Still, within these two assumptions are two additional and equally troubling assumptions. One, religions are irrational and incapable of delimiting themselves. That is to say, the standards of rational debate must be externally derived. And two, the state's authority trumps that of religious institutions or beliefs. What might it mean to speak of religious freedom when religions are both defined and regulated by the state? Regardless of whether or not there's a way to understand religious freedom within such a construct, what is clear is the extent to which such a position is problematic for religious believers. I'm not the first to expose the negative assumptions about religion at work in the question regarding its role in the public sphere. Thinkers, of course, such as John Howard Yoder and Stanley Hauerwas and Talal Assad have long challenged the prioritization of the state over religion. Still, one finds far fewer Jewish thinkers adopting such a critique. Nonetheless, I have argued frequently in favor of such a Jewish critique on the following grounds. One, Judaism is an inherently self-delimiting tradition which does not require external determinants for rational participation in the pluralist setting. And two, Jews should not be asked to subordinate their acknowledgement of God's authority and the determination of the function of their tradition by the state. Jewish participation in the public square can and should emerge from the standards and self-regulating procedures of the Jewish tradition itself. Such an account, I argue, mirrors a second interpretation of the religion clause, whereby provision 2, that is to say the free exercise of religion, determines provision 1, the disestablishment of religion by Congress. The above position reflects the classic rabbinic principle regarding Jewish participation in non-Jewish society, a principle known as dina de malchuta, which is to say the law of the kingdom is the law. In contrast to the above query regarding the proper role of religion within the state, Dina de Malchuta provides a principle whereby Jews are obligated to participate within and recognize the non-Jewish state without a tacit acceptance of any sort of secular ideology and its attending prejudices regarding religious irrationality and the need to constrain religious believers. Why? Dina de Malchuta encourages obedience to the law of the Jewish state clearly on halachic, that is to say Jewish legal and therefore theological grounds. Such a halachic or Jewish legal justification for participation in the non-Jewish state can be best appreciated by the limits it places upon obedience to the laws of the non-Jewish state. That is to say, there are instances where Dina de Malchuta would require a Jew to disobey the laws of the non-Jewish state. Generally speaking, the rabbis distinguish two jurisdictions, laws of the state concerned with economics and civil affairs, and then strictly religious matters. So, any state requiring Jewish obedience to laws which would compromise strictly religious affairs, that is to say marriage, which became a big point of contention, would lose its legitimacy. In such instances, Jewish disobedience to state law would be halachically justified. Still, if Dina de Malchuta operates as a leading principle in understanding the terms and the limits of a Jewish commitment to the state, it also implies, this is the second part of it, a Jewish capacity to positively engage in discourse in a multicultural environment without the need for paternalistic external prompts deriving from a supposedly modern rationality. What do I mean? To make the point, let me return to Jose Casanova's account of the intervention of Catholic bishops in American political discourse. Casanova supports, as I indicated before, an active Catholic voice in the public square. However, Casanova argues that such engagement does not leave Catholicism unaffected. Once a player at the table, Catholicism, he says, becomes impacted by the external positions that it meets. If, he argues, here's the quote, the bishops have now asserted their right and competence to intervene in public affairs, they also have come to recognize the public's right to judge their pronouncements in accordance with universalistic criteria of open, rational debate. Inevitably, Casanova says, criteria from the public sphere will spill over into the ecclesiastical sphere. Eventually, the ecclesiastical institution will have to learn to respect the human dignity of all its members. Only by retreating again to a private sectarian refuge and abandoning its claims to public religion in the modern world can the church escape the unintended consequences of having entered the modern public sphere, unquote. There are a number of serious problems with Casanova's analysis. Of greatest concern is his suggestion that it's only by virtue of an engagement with the rational universal criteria of the public debate that Catholicism can successfully participate in pluralistic conversation or engage in any sort of institutional self-critique. Catholicism, in other words, must outsource rationality in order to guard against its own natural tendency to retreat into sectarianism. I have little reason to doubt that Casanova would speak any differently about Judaism's limited capacity for self-regulation. Casanova's perspective reflects a deeply unfortunate neglect for the internal reasoning structures of religious traditions. In his analysis of the law of Dina de Malchuta, my dissertation advisor, my Dr. Potter, David Novak, argues that as a halachic law, Dina de Malchuta offers an example of the rationality of Jewish law, generally speaking, or what may be referred to as the natural law, that in his view constitutes the very condition of the possibility of any particular law, Jewish or otherwise. Law, generally speaking, Novak argues, all law, all particular law, presupposes an impulse toward justice in persons that's evident in the very structure of social existence. As social creatures, Novak argues, individual persons are not sovereign over one another. Individual interests are always delimited by the interests of others. Persons are finite. They neither make themselves nor dwell alone. They are created. Jewish law, according to Novak, like many other legal systems, inevitably presupposes this theo-human condition. Novak actually holds that there is a theo-human condition at the very basis of the American legal system as well. It's a controversial claim, but it's his claim. Since, however, this condition or limit appears within the particular laws of any given society, reason, Novak argues, cannot be outsourced. There is no rational language exterior to the presentation of reason within specific cultures. In my own work, I present a somewhat different account of the rationality inherent within Judaism and Christianity, premised less on an analysis of the limits of sociality and rooted more directly in the character of lawfulness that emerges out of the covenant relation between a revelatory God and recipients of revelation. In my account, divine love expressed in revelation simultaneously affirms persons as persons, while it delimits persons as other than the God who loves them. From this perspective, recipients of God's revelation are at once free to testify to the event of revelation through the language of their particular tradition, halacha, Torah, tefillah, prayer, etc., with the recognition, however, that the very condition of the possibility of their sacred language, that is to say, God's love, also expresses itself to others, and therefore cannot, without severe limitation to the character of God's freedom, be limited to the Jewish community alone. That is to say, the condition of the possibility of my tradition is the possibility of the freedom of another tradition to express its own account of the revelatory event itself. Jewish life inevitably transpires alongside other traditions. This is not the same as saying that Jewish life needs to be altered because of other traditions. There's a difference between recognition of another and the mandate to be changed by the other. Jewish participation in a multicultural setting does not mandate the sort of vulnerability to external critique described by Casanova. Recognition of difference, in my account, generated by the reality of divine love, does not coerce traditions into self-nullification, but gives them the freedom to operate as what they are, particular articulations of the divine, when other such articulations are also possible. Moreover, my account does not prohibit an engagement I know you're telling me I have no more time, with others that might impact upon the tradition itself. Okay. In closing, let me just end with the following two interesting little anecdotes that will be take-home things for you. You'll be interested. If, as I've argued, a reversal of the analysis concerning religion's proper place in the public square is important for a legitimate recognition of what it means to promote freedom of religion, the American Jewish community itself, I think, has much to gain from such an insight, and dare I say, the Israeli Jewish community too. For centuries, Jews celebrated what they took to be the marriage between Judaism and America. Undoubtedly, Jews have benefited from life in the United States, but Jewish success in America has come at a price. Too easily, Jews have subordinated their traditional and theological commitment to either an unreflective support of American nationalism, on the one hand, or the pursuit of what Michael Walzer refers to as meat and potatoes multiculturalism, that is, the drive to secure material interests. One might even argue that it's been the dialectic between assimilation and identitarianism that has governed Jewish history. I want to argue that an unreflective embrace of Jewish identity has no essential core, and that Judaism's future in America, and arguably in Israel as well, must be generated and directed by the theological demands of the tradition, and not by the state or outside culture. The same holds, I think, for Judaism within Israeli political life. So let me just juxtapose two texts that will make the point, and those would be my closing statements. In an editorial published in Haaretz, this was just a few weeks ago, Donnie Hartman was writing in response to the Egyptian uprising. And he wrote an editorial, it was called something like The Politics of Hope, something like this. In this editorial, he encouraged Israeli Jews to embrace the Egyptian revolution within the spirit of what he called a politics of hope. So I see this rhetoric, I'm very interested in this kind of language. So I read the article. But from where does Hartman argue Jews could garner such hope? Well, he goes on to say, Israel's essence is a rejection of the need for a messianic hope. The meaning of sovereignty and the consequences of power are that we no longer need to respond to pain and suffering with the plea to God to redeem us. As long, Hartman says, as Israel's hope is grounded in the realpolitik of sovereignty and guided and protected by the power we have acquired, it will not lead us into reckless policies and unnecessary dangers, but rather into the possibility of finding new ways to overcome the reality of uncertainty, unquote. Really? Israel's embrace of the realpolitik of sovereignty does not, quote, lead to reckless policies and unnecessary dangers? Consider, by contrast, and these are the last couple of lines, remarks made by a leading Jewish thinker, Yehoshua Leibovitz, in an essay entitled The Religious Significance of the State of Israel. In this essay, Leibovitz says, quote, "To me, Zionism meant the endeavor to liberate Jews from being ruled by the Gentiles. In opposition to some, however, I believe that no state whatsoever, in any society, in any era, in any culture, including the Jewish culture, ever was or will be anything but a secular institution. It's not service of God. Religion, that is, man's recognition of his duty to serve God, cannot be integrated with the machinery of government. The political organization, necessary as a condition of survival, merely sets the ground for religion. Regarding the state as an intrinsic value is the essence of fascism," unquote. I share Leibovitz's position, and in conclusion think that Jewish political participants anywhere in the world would be wise to keep his keen assessment of priorities in mind. Thank you.
Okay, now we'll turn to our third panelist, Rabbi Saperstein.
Marshall indicated that religion and culture are often connected with each other. A wonderful manifestation of that is that in the other two panels, people will have met the task of cutting their 25-minute talks down to 10 minutes through the discipline of cutting their speeches. And the Jewish approach is simply to talk twice as fast. I'm going to join with Randi in her remarkable speech and her approach to dealing with that. Let me deal with two of the questions that are that we were given to deal with. I'll leave the third for discussion. The question of whether religious groups and individuals have a right to speak out on public policy issues, I think is clear to everyone. There is a constitutional right that religious groups and religious organizations enjoy just as much as non-religious individuals and organizations do, to say whatever they want, to make full use of the freedom of speech, freedom of publication, freedom to petition a government to redress grievances, freedom of association that all other groups want as well. But whether it is healthy for democracy or religion to do so depends on context, and two key issues limit the prospect of such exercises. One, no one has a right to impose their religious practices or beliefs on others using government power. But I want to distinguish between religious rituals and practices, etc., and the fact that someone holding a view from a religious standpoint may well have that view coextensive with others holding that view, and their exercise of the democratic process to have that view implemented into law is not an example of posing religion on other people. But I'm going to come back to that. And secondly, religious arguments can be helpful as a moral code and guide. They must be accessible to human logic. This is a variant of what Randi was saying. It can only be rooted in religious faith. If a senator or a church group makes an argument on behalf of or against a public policy based only on religious belief, how can you have a rational discourse in the free marketplace of ideas? If someone says, I want you to vote for or against a health care bill because God says so, what is the debate that evokes? God did not say so? Yes, she did. No, he didn't. God doesn't talk to people that way. Yes, he does. No, she doesn't. But when out of our religious norms, we make rational arguments about the rights of all to decent health care, including the poor, and argue that such and such is the best way to achieve that, on those religious-based ideas that are susceptible to rational discourse, the religious community makes a significant contribution. Let me use the model of the Catholic bishops' pastoral letters on nuclear arms, economic justice, environmental ethics. In traditional Catholic thought, there are two sources of authority. The first is Catholic dogma, doctrine, law. These are directly applicable to believers. The second is natural law, rooted in human reason, accessible to all, in the human reason that God has given us all, and accessible to all. In exploring the insights of Catholic doctrine and law, the bishops lifted up the moral insights of their distinctive tradition. It did not, however, seek to impose religious doctrine, law, dogma on America, but rather took those moral insights and then in the pastoral letters argued them in forms that can enrich the free marketplace of ideas. And in doing so, added significantly to the moral discourse and the political discourse of America. Well, the same is true in the Jewish tradition. Here I take Randi's point, but from a slightly different wording, but the same conclusion. Jewish law comes from a covenant between God and the Jewish people. Covenant, fancy name for a contract. Contract can only be binding upon those people who enter into it directly themselves or through an agent. And the organizing principle of Jewish law was that those Jews who stood at Sinai stood in constructive agency for all the generations of Jews to come, whether they're born into the covenant or choose to enter the covenant. It is binding upon them. Yet every Jewish child is born into it. At the age of majority, they have to affirm the acceptance of the covenant. They do so either by living constructively under the laws or in the last 1,000 years through a ceremony that we know as bar mitzvah and more recently bat mitzvah, which literally means child of the commandment. I am a child of those commandments. So it is binding upon Jews. Who wasn't at Sinai? Everyone else. There is no logic within the eternal logic of traditional Judaism that suggests that the covenant at Sinai was binding upon non-Jewish societies. We don't go out and try and pass laws saying people ought to observe the Sabbath on Friday night and Saturday, ought to eat kosher food. But there are universal themes. They come from another covenant in the Bible, the Noahide covenant, that your teacher David Novak has written so compellingly about, of universal laws applicable to all ethical individuals in society. The first kind of Geneva Convention in the history of the world of ethical behavior for countries. In the prophetic traditions, universal ethics, and in the non-legal components that you are all familiar with and that are part of our common religious traditions. The infinite dignity and value of every human being derived from the belief we're created in the image of God, the equality of all people, the belief in the ability of people, and this may be distinctive or particularly emphasized in Judaism, to improve themselves in society, capable of bringing about the messianic times of peace and justice. The belief in the rule of law, to which even the highest human rulers are held accountable. The pursuit of peace and justice, and perhaps most importantly, the belief in human reason and human choice, freedom of choice. These are applicable to all people in all societies for all times. It doesn't mean that the rabbinic models of how to apply those in a Jewish context may not be relevant to America. They may be, but not because we believe it's binding upon America, but rather because we believe it can, like the Catholic bishops' letters, that it can enrich the dialogue and debate that America is engaged with. And just a word about elections. I hope we have a chance to talk about this that Marshall raised here. It seems to me the difference in terms of the role of religious groups in elections is the role of religious groups, the role of religious leaders is to raise the moral issues at stake and give guidance on those in an election. But it should not be to use religious authority, religious discipline, religious threats in order to compel people to vote a certain way or for a certain candidate. I think that's bad for religion, bad for democracy. Delighted to discuss that in greater length later. On the third question, the bedrock principles of our bedrock principles of free exercise, separation of church and state, how relevant to the world. What is at stake in those from our standpoint are three basic principles. First, the right of people to worship and live their religious lives in accordance with their conscience. Second, that no one's rights or opportunities as a citizen should depend on their religious beliefs, religious identity, or religious practices. That was a genius, a revolutionary vision of the American scheme. That the ban on religious tests for office, promise of free exercise, the disestablishment of religion ensure that no one's rights as citizens would be compromised by their religious identity, beliefs, or practices. Like many rights promised in the Constitution or founding documents, it took us a long time to actually get there. But certainly in the last 60, 70 years, we have. And for us as Jews, that's meant more rights, more freedoms, more opportunities in America than we've known anywhere else in the diaspora world. These goals, and third, and this raises Marshall's point about social connections here, ensuring that government will not be controlled by religion, and religion will be autonomous from government control. In general, I believe these goals are worthy of being emulated in every country, representing as they do core fundamental human rights as enshrined in international human rights accords. But the means to those ends can be achieved in ways other than ours. It doesn't require a total separation of church and state to ensure religious freedom, that one's rights are not infringed upon. But where religion is linked with government, then I would suggest to you it is much harder to achieve religious freedom. It can be done, but there needs to be more government monitoring, vigilance to ensure that those rights, fundamental rights of free exercise of religion, and the rights of individuals as citizens without regard to their religious identity are protected here. And that is a central challenge to us. Freedom of religion is inexorably linked with other freedoms. That's why for us it was, for our founders, the first freedom. If you can't have tolerance of different religions, if you can't ensure their protections, then all other freedoms are going to be jeopardized. It is the canary in the mine when it comes to fundamental freedoms. So when we see the changes now taking place in Egypt, we see the changes taking place in other countries throughout the Middle East, it is in our democratic countries' interest, from the Western world and other areas of the world who care about fundamental democracy and freedom, to push very hard that the new structures that will be erected ensure religious freedom. For if we do, it will enhance the stability of that society, and it will enhance the democracy and other freedoms in that society. One final point, and to conclude here, I really believe that there are other models in America that are important, which don't have so much to do with the law. Interfaith dialogue, cooperation. That has made all the difference in America. Look at the Catholic community and the Jewish community, how far we've come because of dialogue, because of looking for cooperative endeavors to undertake together. We've transformed our relationship from one of bitter centuries of bitter hostility to one of extraordinary closeness and cooperation, and done so staggeringly in the space of 2 generations in American life. And that is replicated by religious cooperation and interfaith dialogue and joint activities all across America, and through a model to others, through the extraordinary work that Catherine leads with the World Faith Development Dialogue on an international scene. It is why we created something like the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, and why we pursue interfaith cooperation across the globe. And finally, it seems to me the central challenge we have is how to combat religious extremism. I'm not talking about theological extremism, but rather the extremism that comes when people believe their views are so right, they can impose their religious views on others using force when necessary. How do we combat that? On this, I think democracies and religious communities have not been very wise. We haven't understood that sometimes our very embrace of the people we want to help, the moderate religious segments, that our very embrace sometimes can undercut their strength, their legitimacy in the eyes of the people we want them to affect. This has been a failure to me of American foreign policy. I think we have to be far more sophisticated about it. I think it's been a failure of how religious groups here try to help moderate religious forces all across the globe. I hope we'll have time to talk about that, but it remains to me, I think, something that we must get right in the next couple of years because time is running out. Thank you.
Well, thank you all. It's, as always, quite fascinating to see, with 3 of the same questions, how you can get 3 different agendas, different substance, and different style. And thank you all for leaving us enough time for some discussion. The first thing I want to do before we open it to questions from the floor is to see if you have any burning issues for each other that you'd like to jump into right away. What do you think we should be discussing? Are there areas that you disagree with?
Oh, definitely. There's an internal theological dispute amongst the followers of the Lubavitcher Rebbe as to whether or not he is the Messiah or not. So I was very intrigued by Marshall Breger's use of the present tense about the Lubavitcher Rebbe who died a number of years ago. So.
Well, we need a long time for that discussion. Although I'm not a Messianist, which actually leads me to one point I would make, and partly, maybe that I didn't fully understand, or perhaps I disagree with the distinction that was made between the views of Daniel Hartman and Yeshua Leibovich. I mean, this goes to the big meta question of religion and faith, not so much in the American context. It seems to me that Hartman was saying that Zionism is not a religious project. It's a project of the Jews to rule themselves, to be a force in history. It's certainly true that and I think what he's saying, this is in contrast to Messianism, Messianic Zionism, because in the context, in the debate within Israel, there's a debate between the Messianic Zionists who would say, because we are near the end of days, perhaps normal rules don't apply, but in any event, because we are near the end of days, we can bring the end of days by settling all the land of Israel, including the West Bank and Judea. So he's saying, no, I reject that. Zionism is a normal political project. And therefore, since it's a normal political project, it doesn't have to be an extreme project. It can make compromises based on realpolitik. I'm not so sure that that secular states tend to moderation as opposed to extremism. We've seen many secular states that have ramped up to great extremism, and maybe they would have been better off with a touch of the humility of religion. I don't know. I think what Leibovich was saying is that is saying, look, the secular state is one thing and religion is another, and don't fool yourself. He's also talking about American exceptionalism. He's talking about Islamic kind of imperialism, that should be a caliphate. And he's talking also about, in terms of Judaism, that the extent to which the Jewish state is a religious state, is a messianic state, reflects God's will, therefore they have to be correct. So I think there is a lot of meta question, maybe it was discussed in the other 11 conferences, about the relationship between the state as a secular institution and religion as a godly institution, and if they can connect. As I say, the United States tends to think we are exceptionalists, that God has touched us in some way, and I think that Leibovich would be rejecting that notion also.
Can I just respond to that? Just to say, I absolutely appreciate the point regarding Hartman's desire to distinguish his brand of Zionism from any kind of Messianic Zionism. I mean, I think that that's correct. But I also think that we should be cautious to not try to dissolve the distinction between Leibovich's view and Hartman's view. The way that you described it just now makes it almost seem as if both of them are actually advocating a very careful parsing out of religion and state, that Hartman is, in effect, only trying to separate sovereignty from messianism, that is to say religion, and in effect that's what Leibovich is doing as well. But I don't think that that's the case, because I think that what we actually see, particularly in this quote and in this editorial, is Hartman's almost single-minded confidence in realpolitik at the expense not just of a messianic Zionism, but any other kind of, there's a middle ground between messianic hope and a single-minded hope and confidence in realpolitik. And that can be a humble religious hope that doesn't express itself messianically, but waits patiently. And I think that, I think Leibovich is not trying to actually, he's not trying to create a false dichotomy between secularity and the religious. He recognizes that political life is a necessary element for survival, but he wants to demonstrate that Jews should recognize that there's a difference with regard to what both of these entities do for the Jewish community. The politics does one thing, it's for survival, but really the core of Jewish life is from the tradition itself. So I think that they are different positions.
I don't know what no offense, I'm not sure what we're debating. I mean, but it's very clear that certainly the later Leibovich, at the beginning, Leibovich wanted a theological state. He was overwhelmed by the miracle of 1948. But the later Leibovich says that the state is a secular, it's Caesar's things. So, I mean, there's a clear distinction. Hartman he's not a big thinker, so he doesn't quite grasp that his whole tradition is somewhat religious Zionist, that in some way the state is a religious miracle. The difference between him and the Messianists is that he thinks that it's the dawn of the redemption. It's like the beginning. You got a long way. It's the gatehouse. You got a long way to the actual mansion, whereas the the messiness think we're actually at the mansion. So we're in the end of days. But I meant, the real question is a state a religious being? And I think both of them here are saying that it's not. So they're not differing with themselves.
Right, but the question is how much confidence do you put in the state? Where do you put your eggs? What's your basket of choice? And clearly,
Well, if it's not a religious, if it's not a religious entity, then it has to have all the flaws of a secular entity. I
Right,
mean,
but
that's
Leibovitz
it.
would never say anything to the effect, we can have confidence in realpolitik all the way. We don't need a redeemer. We're just going all the way with Israeli political power. That's where we can stop. I mean, that is exactly not his position.
Now, we can discuss that another time.
No, but I
Okay.
mean, for the audience, though, I mean, I think the question is, what is the nature of Jewish confidence in the secular political state? I mean, if it is the case, as you're arguing, that both of them understand that there's a place for the secular state, then the question is, it's the question of the panel. What is the purpose of the secular state, and with what set of eyes should Jews regard it? If it's for survival, if it's for political necessity, or is it something more? Do we put more confidence in it than that? That's the question on the table.
Just want to give David a quick chance to.
I just want to explain something obvious here about use of terms. It's a little bit confusing when we talk about religion in this context, because we're using it two ways simultaneously. One way is kind of in contemporary Protestant terms about religion as a separate sector of life that is different from the economic, political, social life of entities, but has to do with the ritual life of and spiritual life of people here. And then we use it as being synonymous with Judaism, religion in this context, Jewish religion and Judaism. And Judaism, of course, arose at a time in the world where all of the great civilizations were, what today we call religious entities, cultural entities, their own language, literature, dance, music. They were national entities with their own nation states, Babylonia, Greece, Rome, Egypt, etc. And it was all about Judaism as a civilization in that sense, with all of those kinds of aspects of it. So just, it doesn't have anything to do with the substance of what this interesting discussion is. I just want people to hear the different use of terms here. In this case, I think we're using religion primarily in its contemporary term here, but I just wanted to sort out a little bit of the terminology.
We have about 20 minutes left in this panel, and we have microphones. So I suggest we take 2 or 3 questions, if you have them. If you could keep them short, give a quick introduction of who you are, and then turn to the panel. So, questions?
Good morning. My name is Meher Qayyum. I'm a Georgetown alum. I'm Muslim by faith, but American nationality. Thank you for your comments. My quick question to each of you is basically, I think Dr. Rashkover, you mentioned that there's 2 realms of law, the trade and economic and civil society type of law, and then the theologian law with marriage and society. And just as someone who has grown up with all 3 faiths in my life, I'm just wondering to what extent one can parse civil society into each of those laws, because it seems like when it comes to family choices, and we see this, I think, Rabbi Saperstein, you mentioned that, there are groups that will say, God says, for example, abortion is wrong, or God says it's not. So this is an issue that kind of touches upon both realms, and I'm wondering how each of you would approach that type of problem.
Let me just give the point of clarification. The point actually emerged from rabbinic discussions, where when the rabbis were trying to discern how is it that Jews are going to operate in a non-Jewish society legally, they realized that they had to make certain distinctions between certain sets of laws that were really areas of life that were non-negotiable. And so they understood understood that there were certain, again, political matters that that were things that came from the non-Jewish society they were going to have to accept, but there are certain matters that were untouchable. That's not to say that Jews don't, as we just heard, Jews don't really understand the law holistically. I mean, there really is no area of life that isn't legislated. But this distinction, which by the way is not hard and fast within the rabbis, it's a pragmatic distinction that the rabbis are making. And if you look at the rabbinic legal tradition, you'll see that they're constantly negotiating what are the boundaries of that sort of. And a lot of rabbis would say, in fact, that it's a false distinction altogether. But it's in large measure a pragmatic distinction that enabled them to be able to live in non-Jewish societies with a certain degree of tolerance for being in those societies. But it shouldn't be understood to compromise the notion that when Jews go to the polls or when Jews vote, that they don't bring their entire halakhic orientation with them, because they do.
Yeah, I find that very interesting. If we had more time to go back and forth, I was going to ask you about what I heard you to say, that somehow dina de malchut dina, this rule that the law of the land in which Jews live is a law, except where it requires violation of Jewish ritual law. It is, by the way, one of the few places in the halakha, in the Jewish tradition, where ritual law is treated differently as a category than other laws. But I heard you to say that dina no malchut dina itself was an expression or a form of natural law, where I had thought very much it was a realpolitik response that applied to almost any society where Jews where they weren't discriminated against or persecuted, that rule would apply. I hadn't thought about it.
I wasn't arguing that dina de malchuta is a form of natural law. That's Novak's argument.
Got it.
Novak
Okay.
makes the argument that what makes it possible for Jews to recognize the mandate that they have to be able to come to terms in some kind of rational way with the non-Jewish society they live with demonstrates that implicit within dina de malchuta is the recognition that there are other people who live in the planet and that we have to get along with them. That is to say, natural law, that there are certain universal connections that we can make and that the Jewish legal tradition provides the possibility for.
I would have thought force majeure is an alternate explanation.
So in response to your question about abortion, here, this exemplifies a point I've made before. I'm in general a staunch church state separationist. I just think it's good for religion and good for the country, but particularly good for religion, protecting the autonomy of religion from, with government money comes government rules, regulations, monitoring, auditing, here serious problems for us. I understand we have respectful differences in this room on that issue, but it's something I feel strongly about. But this is an example of some of my church state separationist colleagues and friends. I think go a step too far when they say, for instance, that when the Catholic Church advocates abortion, it's a violation of separation of church and state. They're trying to impose their religious views on people. That was a distinction I took the time to make before. I don't believe that to be true. I think that is not just a faith statement of theirs, but one accessible to rational discourse in the free marketplace of ideas that can be debated. And the fact it happens to be coextensive with what their faith view is, I don't think prevents you from doing any more than when I say, I believe God's called us to be protectors of God's creation, therefore I want to see the Endangered Species Act passed, and I'm trying to impose my religious views on people, or when I say God has called us to care for, in Christian terms, the least among us, or to care for the widow and the orphan and the poor and the children and the elderly, and there's responsibility of the public sector to do it, because that's the model, that we have, and God has commanded us to do that. I'm not imposing my religious views on people. It happens to be coextensive with my views, but when I explain it in congressional testimony and public debates, I'm explaining in logical argumentation that is accessible to acceptance or refutation by people, perhaps using the models of my tradition as a moral inspiration to people, but not trying to impose religious doctrine and dogma, and I think it's an important distinction.
Good. Other questions? Can we come over here? The lights are bright, so I can't see hands terribly well, so if you can be a little bit
Sure.
aggressive.
Thank you. This is for everyone.
Could you introduce yourself?
Oh, sure. Faith McDonald from the Institute on Religion and Democracy. And we've really made the point, I think all of you've made the point, that we don't necessarily, in Richard John Newhouse's terms, want a naked public square. We want the influence of religious thought and morals. And I want to take that because we've seen in some cases democracy manipulated and used against us, even in this country. I would like to know, what would be your advice to a brand new democracy? I'm thinking of the Republic of South Sudan, which just has become independent. How do they stay a free democratic society with religious freedom for all when sometimes being a democratic society allows the violations of religious freedom just by being so free? Thank you.
Do we have some other questions, or should we jump right into South Sudan? Okay, let's.
You're pointing somewhere, Tom.
Okay, let's take another question.
I'm Peggy Kay. I'm a newly minted PhD in theology, ethics, and the human sciences from Chicago Theological Seminary, which is an affiliate of the University of Chicago. So I'm new to Washington as well. Professor Breger, I made a note of a comment you made, which I hope I got right. Religious freedom is a problem if it disorders society. And I'm wondering if you or anyone on the panel would like to say more about the relationship of religion and religious freedom as it orders or disorders society, particularly because we tend to think of a secular state as an institution that orders society. And it would be interesting to explore the aspect of religion and social order. Thank you.
Good. Is there a third question? Okay, let's take this one, and then we'll turn to the panel.
Hi, my name is Monica Way. I'm from the Washington Examiner. And my question is for Rabbi Saperstein. I was wondering, you mentioned that it is in our best interest that government support burgeoning democracies which protect the freedoms of religion. And you also mentioned that our government has, in certain cases, harmfully supported certain moderates. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on both of those positions and say how they sort of work together. In what way should the American government be supporting other democracies?
Good. Well, that gives us a good menu of questions. Who'd like to start?
You want to start?
Well, okay.
Go ahead, because you had that question.
Well, I don't know anything about the South Sudan, so which is not just a way of getting out of talking. It's a way of saying that I think that you need to know about, if you want to make advice to societies, you've got to really know about the societies. You know, when after we conquered Iraq, the Coalition Provisional Authority, I think that's what it was called, they wanted to make a constitution a la 1787 in Philadelphia, and with all mod-con freedoms, particularly in front of religion. And of course, the social, this gets to what I was saying about the social disorder. The social order in Iraq opposed it. Even the ones who were, getting American money opposed it, because they didn't want to have an individualist society, because in their world, their society had a religious base. This doesn't mean it had to be monolithic, but it had a religious base. It was a Islamic society, and they wanted a constitution that reflected that. So first, we need to know the details about, about animism and things like that in South Sudan, or I know there's tensions between animism and Islam, but you have to know more before you speak. But on the general question, I think we have to recognize that in America we approached individual religious freedom. In much of the world, it's where religion is a social phenomenon, and it's a part of the social order. Things are what we see as individual freedom is seen as attacks on the state. And this is clearest in the three areas of religious freedom which we care a lot about, which we should care a lot about, but which other societies find often most difficult: blasphemy, conversion, and proselytism. So there, it's not a question of, well, you can have a church or you can have a synagogue. It's that these are seen as a kind of attacks on the social order. The Malaysian High Court, I wrote this example once, that they say, look, people are going to be seekers, spiritual seekers. So if someone's going, we can't stop them. We shouldn't stop them from the religious freedom to be a seeker. So they want to find out about Buddhism or about Judaism, about Christianity. They should be free to do that. But we see the proselytizer, now maybe, of course, it's a caricature in their understanding. We see the proselytizer as coming in and giving the information not only to the person who wants to hear it, the good news, but they're giving it to the person who's not interested in it, trying to get them interested in it, trying to get them interested in it when they don't want to be interested in it. And that is a kind of disordering society, and that's why we will understand our anti-proselytizing laws to protect the first and not the second. You see this in a strange way in Israel. I don't have time to go into it really, but there's a lot of freedom for religious minorities in Israel, as long as the freedoms are not seen as either symbolically or substantively threatening the Jewish character of the state. So individual freedom for Israeli Arab Christians or Israeli Arab Muslims, but opposition to organizational freedom, because that may be seen as a threat on the state. We can work that out in all the individual ways. But the point is, we see religion in an individual engaging with God. The rest of the world, not the rest, but much of the world sees religion in a social context, and they see some things of what we view as religious freedom as threats to that social order, and they are resisting it. And I think we have to figure out how to work our way. One small example that gives us an indication of how to work our way forward. The Vatican was trying to make concordats with the Muslim world. Morocco wouldn't make a concordat because that would mean they would have to recognize certain universal freedoms, which they didn't want to say. They want to say all rights come from the Koran, not come from human nature or whatever. But they did a letter with the Vatican that gave them everything that they wanted in the concordat. They just didn't call it rights. They called it, well, the Koran gives you all these privileges. Well, again, I gave another example. Human dignity can get you a conversation in many countries where human rights won't. And can even get you farther in some instances than human rights will. Justice, discussion of justice in some societies will get you further than discussion of rights. So, because justice is a social question, rights is an individual question. So that
There's actually no word in classical Hebrew for the word rights.
And that's absolutely correct.
As we know,
That's
Judaism
duty.
is a system
That's
of
duty.
responsibilities.
So the point I'm making is that when we talk about other countries, we need to know the other countries, and we need to see how we can expand our desire to increase freedom using their language. And that fits in also to what Rabbi Saperstein, I think, very presciently said, that if we are promoting the moderate Muslims, it may reduce their influence in their own societies. And I think that is
David, do you
clearly
want to
true.
pick up that question quickly,
Yeah,
and
I
then
mean-
I'm afraid we're going to have to conclude.
Well, let me just respond to a couple of things quickly. Faith, I don't know what you mean by discrimination against religion here in democracy. We clearly have the problem of the Oregon v. Smith case that greatly lowered the protection in the Supreme Court interpretation of the First Amendment of religious freedom. It brought many of us in this room, including you and I, together working on this to try and remedy it legislatively, but it lowered the protection there. And insofar as Scalia's mandate was, it's when challenged, when dissent by, won't this inevitably hurt minority religions if you aren't protected by the Constitution, but you have to go to state legislators to get it? You say, yes, but that's the inevitable price of democracy. Inevitable price of democracy? Our democracy was founded on the notion there's certain fundamental rights that are free of majoritarian rule here. And clearly minority religions will be hurt. Having said that, we've restored some of those protections legislatively, and there are problems all around the country, but it's not a massive systemic problem that we face. We still do pretty robustly. If what you're referring to is the consequences of the Establishment Clause, then I understand that we have a difference of opinion in this room. The Establishment Clause treats religion differently than anything else. It treats religion differently. So there are going to be certain kind of government supports, endorsements, benefits that other entities can get that religion doesn't. Here, I happen to think that's good. I think it's good to keep government out of religion here. And you can't have it both ways. You can't have a cake and eat it too. You can't go to the government and say, don't discriminate against us if you're giving government benefits, money to other nonprofits. Just treat us like anyone else. And then say, but all the special protections that we have, the exemptions, the protections that we have under the Establishment Clause, those should remain exactly the same. The ones that nobody else has. All kinds of things. We don't register as, as lobbyists. We don't have to file 990s. We have a different standard of audits from the trade. You could go down the list of 20 protections that we have in the religious community because of the Establishment Clause. Can't have it both ways. If you want to be treated by everyone else for one thing, you're going to be for other. And I'm scared that those religious groups, and I understand how tempting it is, but it's like selling your birthright for a bowl of porridge. You're losing something truly precious, because I really think the wall separating church and state has allowed religion to flourish with a diversity and strength in America unmatched anywhere in the democratic world today, including every country that has a government-supported established or preferred religion here. The religion and social order question here, I think Marshall and I may have a difference on this. I just believe in the basic thing when it comes to the government that international human rights trumps religious beliefs endorsed by the government. Everyone should be guaranteed certain basic human rights. So if your religious tradition discriminates against religion, the way to deal with that is not by even an established religion within a government to impose on the rights of women. It's to ensure the autonomy of religious communities where people want to voluntarily live within those communities to live they want to live without interference by the government on these questions. And as supporting moderates here, I think we actively, visibly embrace religious freedom when we're dealing with governments, but when we want to support moderates, very often it helps to do it through broad-based coalitions, including people from that faith community whom we're empowering there. Let them take the lead on those issues without our necessarily having to go out and do it. During the fight against communism, our embrace of civil society almost always protected the people who we embrace, the newspapers, the labor unions, the human rights groups, etc. That isn't so true in the battle with extremist Hinduism in India or extremist Islam in places around the world. They use it to say, yeah, you see, the moderates, they're in league with the Western, with proselytization efforts of Catholicism or evangelicalism here, with Western cultural imperialism, etc. here. We have to be much more strategic and careful about doing that. So there are two different things: the embrace with governments of pursuing the protections of religious freedom, but helping moderates stand on their own feet and doing it with coalitions that don't necessarily have them seen as representing our particular interests as the United States of America or the Jewish community or whatsoever. It's a tough tightrope to walk, but I think we have to do a much better job on.
I just make a...
Excuse me, Marshall, just a second. Catherine Marshall said to me, I can't make David stop talking, so we need some muscle up here, and he didn't even recognize that the seat had
No,
changed.
if you had allowed me to, I'd have made him stop.
Okay,
but
we're
that-
going to let Marshall Breger have the last word here, and then we're going to take a break.
I just want to make one small comment on the Establishment Clause, because it goes to this point about democracy not being fair to maybe majority notions in religion. I think we forget today what the founders really understood. They had just come, their memory was the War of Religions, the 30 Years' War, the 100 Years' War. Their memory was real discrimination, people on the rack, people being thrown into the wilderness from the Massachusetts colony. They knew that differences of religion could be intensely divisive, destructively divisive, and that the danger of establishment of religion was that it would move us to the divisiveness and the destructiveness that was clear in their memory. Now we're 200 years later, maybe religion's not so important. People don't kill each other over it anymore. So therefore you could say, well, we need to be able to endorse religion and establish a religion to get religious goals. But behind the Establishment Clause, and the reason why religion was treated in a way differently than other freedoms, in some respects you're right, negatively vis-a-vis democracy, is this notion that religious disputes can destroy a society, as look to all the examples of there. And by the way, if you look around us today at the Balkans and other places, even Iraq, we might be a little more sensitive about being very fast and loose about the Establishment Clause. Thank you for the extra time.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think we have solved the problem of the Jewish approach to religion and politics in American society. So join me in thanking our panelists for a wonderful discussion. Thank you all very much.